Hey everybody, I want to spend a little time with you discussing Robert Frost and the four poems that I assigned this week. So, first, what I want you to know is that Frost is considered to be sort of a liminal figure between 19th century American traditions and modernism. Um, as our book says, he is considered to be a thoughtful reply to high modernism's fondness for obscurity and difficulty. So he's going to kind of reject all of that T.S. Eliot dense free verse with all the different allusions, and he's going to try to be much more clear with his poetry. He's also going to write in traditional poetic forms. Robert Frost famously said, "I'd sooner write free verse as play tennis with the net down." So, in other words, the meter and the rhyme, those traditional forms for him are kind of like the tennis net. They give structure to the game, they give a center to the poetry. So I want to also look at how Frost is considered to be, well, he's a modernist, of course. He's writing in the modern period. But he's also sometimes aligned with the Romantics who came before the Civil War. Um, so, in Romantic literature, one of the themes is nature. This idea that in poetry, especially, the speaker would go out into nature, appreciate its beauty, and be restored somehow. Poetry or nature was good for his soul. And I'd argue that we see this in Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which we'll talk about later. But in design, we get a darker twist on that theme of nature. Another theme in the Romantic movement was individualism, this idealization of the individual. We still see that in a lot of American literature and culture, this idea of the individual versus the community. And so, what I want to suggest in this presentation is that in poems like Mending Wall and The Road Not Taken, we get a kind of a critique of individualism gone too far. All right, so let's look at this poem, Mending Wall. If you haven't yet read it, I'd like you to pause the video and take some time to read it. And I encourage you to read it aloud or find a recording because this poem is much better if you hear it. So we get the bolding here is emphasis that I have added just to show you where a couple of lines are repeated, but we'll come back to that later. Something there is that doesn't love a wall that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. So here's the dilemma that the speaker is talking about. There's a wall, a stone fence between his property and his neighbor's property, but something doesn't love it that sends the frozen groundswell under it. In the winter, the thawing of the frozen ground in the spring, rather, seems to damage the wall. Think of the potholes in the road every spring. Also, we have hunters when the yelping dogs and the rabbits are running around. They tend to knock down the road. The wall. Excuse me. He says nobody has seen this made. Nobody has seen the damage being done, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know, and we agree on a certain day to set the wall between us. So that's the situation. The speaker and his neighbor have met together to fix the wall. They each stay on their own side of the wall and restore the boulders to their proper places in the fence. We get this little mischief here. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until your backs are turned. So we see a little sense of humor perhaps in the speaker, a sense of magic maybe. Notice then the second half of the poem. There where it is we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pine, I tell him. So notice here that the speaker is questioning why we even have the wall. We don't need it. I have apple trees on my side. He has pine trees on his. The trees aren't gonna move. And I tell him this, and the neighbor says, "Good fences make good neighbors." You may have heard this line before. It's often quoted. But notice that the speaker feels mischievous. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are now no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. So here is what the speaker is wondering. Why do we like fences so much? I mean, if we had cows, that'd be one thing. We don't. So before I built a wall, I'd want to know what I was walling in or walling out. What are we doing when we build a wall? What are we separating? And he repeats this line from line 1, right? Something there is that doesn't love a wall and wants it down. I could say elves to him. Again, the speaker's sense of humor comes through. He's imagining this idea of elves coming through. But he knows the speaker's not going to appreciate his sense of humor. He describes the speaker, or the neighbor rather, like an old stone savage, armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well that he says it again, good fences make good neighbors. So this poem is about the tension between these neighbors, right? One of them really loves having that fence between them, like a lot of Americans do. You look around, how many houses, how many backyards have fences around them. Good fences make good neighbors. We are individuals, we like our privacy, we keep to ourselves. However, the speaker is questioning that. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. So this is often taken to be Robert Frost's critique of that individualism and independence that perhaps isn't necessary, and maybe it's better if we don't have walls between us. So when you read this poem, you might notice that it does not rhyme, right? However, it does have a regular meter, and that's harder to notice. This is written in iambic pentameter. That sends the frozen groundswell under it. Da 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 da. There are occasional lines with a couple extra syllables in there, but in short, this is unrhymed iambic pentameter, and the name for that is blank verse. So Robert Frost is using an older traditional poetic form, blank verse, to write this poem. Let's take a look at the next one, The Road Not Taken. This is, I'm guessing, a poem you might be familiar with, especially these last few lines. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So the way this poem is typically interpreted is as a message about the importance of going your own way. Take the road less traveled. Do your own thing, and that's going to make the difference, right? We love that message. And so I often hear these lines quoted in that spirit. But I want to suggest to you that this poem is wildly misinterpreted. And other scholars have pointed this out as well, too. So notice how he establishes the situation. He's in the woods, and there are 2 roads, and he can't take both and be one traveler. And so he's looking down and trying to figure out which road to take. And notice how he says that the other one is just as fair. Though, as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. The traveling that's happened on this road is really about the same. And both that morning equally lay. The middle of this poem tells us that the paths are the same. They are pretty much equal. But he knows he can only take one, and he knows that he'll probably never come back because that's how life is, and he'll never have a chance to explore where the other road would have taken him. So in the future, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. I took the road less traveled by. But he didn't take the road less traveled by. The poem tells us that the 2 roads are the same. He just later embellishes and decides to kind of fib about that, right? So this poem is not the paean to individualism that it's often interpreted to be. It is about a man who is telling the story of his choices and perhaps truly wondering what would have happened if he had taken another path. I want to point out that this poem does have a regular rhyme scheme. Notice the A-B-A-A-B rhyme scheme. Would, stood, and could are A, both, and growth. Every stanza has 5 lines, and they are written in iambic tetrameter, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So 4 stresses in each line. So he's definitely using a regular rhyme scheme and a regular meter. Again, in free verse, he wouldn't be using either of those things. All right, the third poem that I assigned to you is, I think, the most difficult, Design. So in this poem, in these first 8 lines, he's describing something he encounters. a fat white spider on a white heelal. A heelal is a flower that's normally purple or blue. And the spider is holding up a moth, like a white piece of rigid satin cloth. So maybe that means the moth is dead. In fact, he calls them assorted characters of death and blight. Not a very positive description of this image, right? He compares them to the images or to the ingredients of a witch's broth. In the second part of the poem, he asks a series of questions about this. Why is that flower white? It's usually blue. What brought the kindred spider, the spider that's also white, there? And then what brought a white moth there as well? What are the odds that this is going to happen? How does this happen? This last question is pretty huge here. What but design of darkness to appall? So if there's this idea that everything is planned, that God has a plan, or the universe has a plan, that there's a design, he wonders if this is a design of darkness. After all, he calls this assorted characters of death and blight. Or perhaps design doesn't even govern in a thing so small. Perhaps these things are just random. So either the design is dark or these things are too small to be designed. So he's taking this romantic idea of nature, going out into nature and being struck by its beauty, but this is an image of darkness, of death and blight. I want to talk about the form of this poem too. If we look at this, I've numbered the lines. You'll notice that it's 14 lines. A group of 8, the octave with the rhyming pattern A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, and then a sestet with the rhyming pattern C-D-C, C-D-D. This is a sonnet, in other words. And the octave describes the situation, and then we have the volta, the twist, where the speaker begins to question this. So here, like the Harlem Renaissance poets Claude McKay and Countee Cullen, Robert Frost is taking a sonnet traditionally meant to be a love poem and using it for a completely different purpose. Okay, the last poem I wanted to discuss with you is Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. And I saved this for last because I think in many ways this is his most delightful poem, at least of the ones that I assigned. I hope that you've read this. Again, pause it if you haven't. And notice how this is about a speaker who is on horseback, apparently, going by these woods. He thinks he knows the owner. The owner won't see him. It's a snowy night, and he's looking at this beautiful view, the darkest evening of the year. But the horse wants to know why they've stopped. He's asking why, if there's a mistake. And the speaker notices the woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I would love to sit here and stare into these lovely woods, in other words, but I have stuff I gotta do. I have a lot of stuff to do before I can sleep tonight. I have commitments to make. This is what the poem is about. Now, this poem has been wildly misinterpreted as about a man who might want to commit suicide. It's a dark evening, and this must refer to death. Or there's even a parody that's been written about how this is about Santa's village in the North Pole, and the horse is a reindeer. None of that. This is just a lovely poem written in, again, iambic tetrameter, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, with a regular rhyme scheme. Just a lovely poem. And this does get at that romantic theme of appreciating nature. So I want to just quickly review some of the terms that I've been using. Let's go back. Free verse here is, again, what Robert Frost does not use. That's poetry that lacks a regular pattern of rhyme and a regular pattern of meter, and a lot of modern poets do use that. But instead, Frost is going to rely on poems with a regular poetic meter. Iambic pentameter or iambic tetrameter in the poems that we read, either 5 or 4 beats per line. He wrote a sonnet design, the 14 lines of iambic pentameter, traditionally a love poem that he adapts. He wrote in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter as well. And remember that the speaker of a poem is different from the poet himself. If you have any questions, please reach out.